afternoon. This is Matt Sonicson again. Here's my audience. Lovely. That's a big one today. Okay, and this is for my second to last speech for public speaking. This is a state your position speech, and I'm going to speak about pacifism. Next speech, I'll get into some pros and cons, but ultimately I'll be talking about why I'm a pacifist in this speech today. Next slide, please. The board doesn't work, so I've got assistance. Thou shalt not kill. Love thy neighbor, but not his wife too much. Violence begets violence. Blessed are the peacemakers. Do unto others as you would have done unto you. I mean, these are fairly basic statements, and they're universal statements through our Judeo-Christian values, which are also secular values and rights are based on. But if you get to the core of it, basically, we ultimately believe that we shouldn't be fighting and killing each other. And I did a survey in the class, and it sort of seems that even people who are sort of pro-war, it seems like the ultimate goal is peace. So I tend to think, why not just shoot for peace anyway? And I think most religions sort of get at this as well. I mean, you can argue that certain religions are more warlike than others, but I think at the core of them, all of them are saying, don't kill each other. Let's move on to the next speech. So, and yet, there's something so basic that we seem to all universally want to not fight and kill each other, yet we still do. And nobody really wants it. And the only people who would want us to fight each other in war are maybe sociopaths or people who sort of profit from it. And there are lots of people who profit from it. And they're the ones who don't get their hands dirty, right? But there are a lot of big businesses, right, who make tons of money from fighting war, whether it's defense systems or outright armaments. There's a lot of money to be made with fighting wars. And if we can consider selling drugs and pornography dirty business, I would assume that war is also a dirty business as well. Let's move on to the next slide, please. In researching this topic, I looked at opposingviewpoints.com, which is a database of various articles where they take an issue and they provide the pros and cons of various articles on that website. And Humanities International Index is also another database of articles. And I watched several speeches on YouTube from this guy named Michael Walzer, who's a just war theorist, and several other philosophers as well. But those are my three main sources. See, I did live reading. Next slide, please. There are going to be two major points that I want to get to in this speech, and there are tons of them you get to, but my two biggest ones is that ultimately fighting each other goes against our basic, most ethics, and the ethics that apply to all societies. There was a philosopher named Cecilia Buck who wrote a book called Common Values in 2002. And she said societies everywhere have values regarding respect to individuals, values and ethics that place restraints on violence, and those which have guarantees of fairness. And you find these in every society. And ones that these are sort of out of balance tend to be more degenerate societies. And then as well, in all religions and all societies, you find some variation of the golden rule. Sort of do unto others or do not do unto others as you would like not unto yourself or do unto yourself. Either way, this sort of comes up everywhere. And fighting each other, killing each other, ultimately is in contradiction with our most basic primitive values. The next point, on the next slide, and again, there's this new, it's not new, it's old, it's called just war theory, but it comes up every few years again. And I think once you try to start talking about war in a moral context, I think you can't avoid getting into what I call Orwellian oxymorons. And in 1984, he writes there's a slogan where war is peace. And I think you can't avoid getting into these contradictions if you're talking about morality and war. A big guy who's into this is Michael Walzer. And he writes a lot about just war theory. And a lot of people in my class, and I won't get into all that now, I sent them sort of what just war theory is and the points that people use that you can sort of morally justify a war. Okay, but that's the other main point that I'm going to get into. Can we get the next slide? To build off on the first point, I'm going to quote Howard Zinn, who was a war hero from World War II, involved in like the first use of napalm in World War II, and as well the firebombing of a lot of cities throughout Germany, Dresden including. And in the 50s, he said, I began to think of war, even a war with as moral a purpose as World War II, taking out Adolf Hitler, as being inadequate. Really, to solve fundamental problems, I began to think of war, even so-called good wars, like World War II, as corrupting everybody, violence begetting violence. And again, I think if you break it down to its most simplest parts, I mean, It's ultimately what it is. It's violence begetting violence. And Howard Zinn was sort of one of the leading voices of the anti-Vietnam War. And the point that he gets into with the good war, I think we take for granted the moral justification of World War II. We just kind of say Hitler had to be stopped and that's it. We don't really think about it. But a lot of bad stuff happened in World War II, and not just the Holocaust. I mean, from the Allies. I mean, they did a lot of bad things. Can we move to the next slide? Pillars of salt and sand. What I'm getting to, and wars in general make bad things happen. In terms of World War II, there's Hiroshima, there's useless and senseless bombing of cities that didn't necessarily have to be done, and ultimately, something that always occurs in war, you've got rape, you've got plundering, you've got innocent lives lost, and this is an inevitable outcome of war. And it's unavoidable once we start fighting each other that these sorts of things are going to happen. As well, fighting wars is a quick and most obviously solution to things. It's a very profitable one, as we mentioned before, for a lot of companies involved in selling armaments, or for politicians who are looking to gain something. But it's a very quick solution, and there's a lot of people who spend a lot of time strategizing things, okay? But ultimately, it's fairly easy, yeah? The people with the biggest guns win. And I think if we look in the long run, it's probably more practical and economical to look at other ways of solving conflicts, even if we have to look at sort of less easy to fix problems. Can we move on to the next? The love movement. Another aspect of pacifism, yeah, is that pacifist movements almost always lack moral dilemmas. You know, if you think of the Vietnam War, or think of World War II, yeah? Let's take Hiroshima, right? Or let's take the use of napalm in Vietnam. Yeah? You don't have any of this in a pacifist movement, yeah? Think of Martin Luther King, or Gandhi, or Nelson Mandela. There's nothing you can criticize about that. Any war you take, even the most good wars, you can find tons of examples where bad stuff happened, where I mean, a lot of people might sling mud at Martin Luther King for having affairs, okay, but you can't really compare this to Abu Ghraib or Hiroshima. I mean, that's ridiculous. And even though some people will try to do that, it's insane. Yeah. So ultimately, I mean, pacifism isn't necessarily the surest key to success, but neither is war. And war involves a lot more death, doesn't it? Move to the next slide. I'm rushing through all this. Again, this comes into the language of war. Yeah. Voltaire, and I'm going to murder this with the French, Questions sur le médical, said, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. And this is what I get into when you start trying to talk about fighting war morally. You get into paradoxical language, you get into oxymoronic language. Yeah? And once you start believing this, that you start fighting wars for good causes, or fighting wars against evil, or to change hearts and minds, you're ultimately getting into oxymorons. And I mentioned George Clooney here. There's this video campaign he did for the UN where he talks about, you know, peace like war must be waged. And it sounds really good, right? Yeah, so you have to actively, strongly engage in peace. But I think ultimately you end up doing more bad than good. And a lot of times with war, if you're talking about from a national aspect, yeah, and think about this in terms of talking about how World War II was always good. And Noam Chomsky says, and talking about war a lot, what we can't escape is this sort of imperialist mentality, yeah. And that's sort of just assuming that what we do is the right thing to do. I'm going to skip over Michael Walzer's stuff. I'm going to get into that more to the next speech. But a lot of times, what you get into when you start talking about the sacrifices you have to make war for a good cause, you get into starting talking about what I call Patton's omelet. And that's this, in order to make an omelet, you've got to break a few eggs kind of thing. And that sounds okay, but when you start talking about people as eggs and omelets, I think you're getting into very amoral territory. The next slide. To sum it up, right? And this is, I know this is going to be really cheap now. But here's the point. I've got 2 boys of my own, right? Both with more hair than I have. And if you think about it, and getting back to this sort of Patton omelet-esque argumentation, there's nothing I would be willing to sacrifice them for. And even if my own life is at stake, there's no cause where it would be like, you know, terrorism is so bad, I'm willing to give up my boys to fight this. Okay, there's nothing where I could say, yeah, that's a good enough cause that I'm willing to sacrifice either of these two. And if I can't say that about my kids, and I'm sure no one here or no one else in the world can say that about their kids, then how can we ask that type of martyrdom of anyone else if we're not willing to ask that of our kids or ourselves? I guess, for me, that's ultimately at the root of pacifism. And would love to hear a good argument against that. Go on to the next. Again, if you talk about this sort of, in order to break, you got to break a few eggs kind of thing, I think that makes for a rotten breakfast. And I've spoken my piece. Thank you. That was lovely.